I live in the state of Washington, deep in the heart of the Pacific Northwest. The region is known for its towering evergreens, heavy mist, and the kind of quiet that clings to everything like a second skin. There's a peculiar isolation to this place, especially in the areas far off from the urban centers, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away, and the howling wind fills the silence in ways that make you think twice before walking outside at night. I used to work the closing shift at a small diner on the side of a desolate highway, a place known more for its worn-out counter stools than its gourmet coffee. At 29 years old, I was in the thick of my life, working hard to make ends meet, keeping my head down and trying not to think too much about how this late-night job was making my anxiety worse. The diner closed at 2 a.m., an odd hour for a business like ours, but considering how sparsely populated the area was, there wasn't a huge rush of people showing up at the hour of deathly quiet. It wasn't like the South, where I had grown up, where diners were bustling with locals, all chattering over waffles and grits well into the night. The people here in the Pacific Northwest, though polite enough, kept to themselves. Conversations were rare, and small talk wasn't part of their repertoire. It was like everyone was preoccupied with something deep in their minds. Or maybe they just didn't have the energy to engage in idle chatter. I was used to it by now. After all, in the South, I had been a waitress for years, constantly managing the demands of overly talkative, boisterous customers. So, while I missed the easygoing charm of those Southern conversations, I didn't mind the quieter, more reserved customers here. It gave me space to work, to think, to be alone without anyone asking how my day was going or, heaven forbid, trying to make some kind of connection that I couldn't summon the energy for. That particular night, like so many others, was approaching closing time. The last call for food came at 2 a.m., but we had a rule at the diner: don't take any orders after 1:55 a.m. The kitchen was already in cleanup mode, and the chef was usually more than a little irritated when people dared to ask for one more coffee or a plate of scrambled eggs after the magic hour. But, like clockwork, a lone figure walked through the door at 1:50 a.m., a bulky man who seemed out of place in the diner. He was wearing an odd pair of jeans, too high up on his waist, and a brown jacket that looked a little too large for his frame. His gray shirt was tucked into the waistband, almost painfully tight, and his mustache looked as if it belonged to a man who still hadn't quite gotten the hang of facial hair. His glasses, thick and round, perched uneasily on the bridge of his nose, making him appear even more awkward than he probably felt. "Would you like a seat at the bar or a table?" I asked him, trying to keep my tone friendly, despite my growing exhaustion. "Table, please," he answered, his voice oddly cheerful, as though he hadn't just walked into a place that was about to close. His smile, however, was uncomfortably wide, and he maintained it for longer than normal. His eyes, framed by those thick glasses, seemed to linger a little too long. I gave him a menu, informing him that the kitchen was closing soon, and that we wouldn't be able to take any orders in about 10 minutes. "No problem," he said, his smile never wavering. "I'll just have black coffee and some French toast. That'll do." I nodded and went back to the kitchen, relaying his order to the chef. The chef gave me a look, one that told me he wasn't too thrilled by this late-night guest. I just shrugged and went back out to the front. As I approached the table, Nolan, he introduced himself as Nolan, waved at me. He struck up a conversation asking where I was from. That question always makes me uncomfortable. When you're from the South, people are always eager to know where you're from, to connect in a way that feels invasive but polite. Here in Washington, it was different. I didn't give him my exact location, only a vague answer about the general area. "Just moved to town recently," he said, with a nervous chuckle, as though he was trying to appear casual, but his eyes were studying me, gauging me. There was something unsettling about his gaze, something that didn't quite fit the image of the man sitting across from me. He seemed harmless enough, perhaps a bit socially awkward, but harmless, right? The chef, like he always did when we were close to closing, came out with Nolan's order, placing the coffee and French toast on the counter. I grabbed it and set it down in front of Nolan, but I could feel the weight of my fatigue pushing down on me. I was so ready to be done with this night. I was done with this shift, Done with the quiet hours that stretched on forever. Done with the fake smiles and pleasantries. I had already started to wipe down the counters, preparing for the moment when the clock would hit 2 and the last customer would leave. Nolan didn't seem in any rush to go. He lingered. The dull hum of the late-night diner contrasted with the silence that hung in the air around us. I kept my distance, staying behind the counter, only stepping out to clear his table and offer him his check. His food was long gone, and we were ready to close, so I did the polite thing and quietly placed the check before him. He paid with his card and stood up, taking a moment to thank me before heading out. I grabbed my belongings, waved goodbye to the chef who was now left to close up, and walked out the door. The parking lot was empty except for my car and the chef's. But there was a third car, an old silver vehicle parked along the dirt by the highway, a strange place to park considering the rest of the lot was empty. I couldn't make out much detail, but I knew it wasn't the chef's car. Was it Nolan's? Maybe. The thought made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off as I slid into my own car and started the engine. I had about a 20-minute drive ahead of me, and it was already well past 2 a.m. As I settled into the highway, I felt the unease from earlier slithering back into my chest. Then, a sudden ding from my dashboard shattered the quiet. Tire pressure warning. Panic flared in my chest. I didn't know how to change a tire. I never learned. I wasn't the kind of person who could deal with car troubles. My heart began to race as I watched the tire pressure plummet from 20 to 10. The car shook, not just the steering wheel but the entire vehicle. Something was wrong. I needed to pull over. The highway was dark, but there was enough of a shoulder for me to get off the road. I stopped the car and hurried out to check the tire. Flat. Completely flat. Before I could even think, headlights sliced through the darkness, coming closer. My heart skipped a beat. It was too late for anyone to be out here. But then I saw it. A familiar face standing at my window with that same unnerving smile. It was Nolan. "Kathy, is that you? Are you okay?" His voice was far too cheerful, the kind of greeting someone would offer when they had all the time in the world to help you. When they had already decided they wanted to insert themselves into your life. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It couldn't be a coincidence. I wasn't stupid. I hesitated, then told him I had a flat tire, playing it off like I was fine, like everything was fine. But when he stepped closer, I knew something wasn't right. The pit in my stomach grew deeper, and I could feel his eyes on me. His gaze too intense, too focused. Nolan insisted that he knew how to fix a flat, offering to help. I didn't want to get out of the car, not with him standing there with that creepy smile plastered on his face, so I lied. I told him I was waiting for my boyfriend to come help me. But even as I said it, I dialed 911 on my phone, keeping the device hidden in my lap as Nolan moved around the car. I was trying to be discreet, trying not to alert him that I was calling for help. The operator answered, and I quietly relayed my location, while Nolan continued to walk around the car, acting like nothing was wrong. That's when it happened. A loud, sudden tap on my window. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. Nolan was there, smiling still, only this time, it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker. "I can help you change that tire," he said again, his voice now lacking any hint of friendliness. "I'm fine," I told him, my voice shaking. "Please, just go away." But then, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering exploded in the silence. My heart leapt in my chest as shards of glass rained down on me. I screamed, throwing my hands up to shield myself, knowing this was no accident. Nolan had done it. He had broken my window. "No!" I screamed, showing the phone screen to him. "I'm calling the police." His eyes flickered to my phone, and in one swift motion, he reached into the car, grabbed the device, and threw it out the window, the phone clattering to the pavement. Then, without a word, he bolted for his car, leaped into the driver's seat, and sped off down the dark, empty road. I was left trembling, trapped in the silence of the night with only the dim light of my car to keep me from being swallowed whole by the darkness. I knew I couldn't go out and search for my phone. There was no flashlight, no way to see. I had to wait, hope, pray that Nolan didn't come back. Finally, the sound of sirens in the distance filled my ears. I sobbed in relief, watching as flashing lights appeared in the distance. The police were here. They arrived in full force, 3 cars in total, their blue and red lights flickering in the night. They were kind, so kind, more than I could have ever expected. They helped me out, changed the flat tire for me, and even gave me an escort back to my apartment. They were genuinely concerned about my safety, taking the time to reassure me. One of the officers later told me they'd checked the diner's security footage. They were working on it. A week later, I got a call from one of the officers. The investigation was ongoing, but they hadn't found anything conclusive yet. Nolan was still out there. I never went back to that diner, not once. The job wasn't worth the risk of running into him again. He'd found me once, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for the moment when I'd be alone again. I left that life behind, hoping the darkness would never find me again. I'm a 15-year-old guy just trying to make some extra cash, and I worked at an amusement park in upstate New York. It was one of those jobs that seemed easy enough, until, well, things went horribly wrong. This happened about a year ago, but the memory still haunts me. Every time I think back on it, my heart races a little faster and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It all began on a crisp October Sunday, one of those chilly fall afternoons that felt like the world was bracing itself for the cold of winter. The amusement park was getting ready to shut down for the season, closing until May. It was the final stretch before the park went quiet, and the place was buzzing with families and thrill seekers trying to get in their last ride. It was supposed to be like any other day, just another shift at work. I had been working at my station for about 5 hours when I glanced at my watch. 4:55 p.m. My shift was about to end, just 5 more minutes. The thought of getting off work made me feel this wave of relief, my exhaustion finally catching up with me. I started packing up my things, half thinking about how I'd spend my evening. But then I saw him. A man, scraggly beard, messy hair, and wearing a faded gray t-shirt with stains on it. His black sweatpants were ripped in places, worn to the point of no return. He approached me slowly, his eyes darting around as if someone, was following him. I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I just wanted to get through these last few minutes. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and professional, though I could feel the unease building in my gut. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me, his eyes wide as though searching my face for something, anything. Then he turned his head to the left, then to the right, scanning the crowd behind him. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the nerves. "Can I help you?" I repeated a little more sharply this time, feeling my patience wearing thin. The man finally responded, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Where are your bathrooms?" His words felt off, like they were meant to be a secret. I pointed up the hill to the right, trying to be as helpful as possible. "Up the hill, to the right." He nodded slowly, almost too slowly, and began walking in the direction I pointed. But as he walked, he kept turning his head, glancing over his shoulder at me. His eyes never left me for too long. It was like I was the only thing he was focused on, and something about it made me feel like prey. I forced myself to look away and avoid eye contact. Before I could shake the feeling off, one of my coworkers showed up to relieve me. I grabbed my stuff and practically ran toward the back room to punch out. I was done with the day, done with him. I just wanted to go home, get out of there, and forget about that weird encounter. I quickly changed into my regular clothes and headed out to the employee parking lot, my mind still racing. I sat down on a bench, hoping to calm my nerves while waiting for Jordan, my 17-year-old coworker, to pick me up. But then something caught my eye, and I froze. There, sitting a couple of tables away in the diner we often went to, was the man. The same man who had asked about the bathrooms. He was just sitting there staring at me. My stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't believe it. What were the odds? I pointed him out to Jordan, but he just shrugged it off, dismissing it as some strange coincidence. "Don't worry about it, Ben," he said. "Probably just someone else who looks like him." But I couldn't shake the feeling. Not at all. Something about the whole thing was wrong. We finished our meal, but I was on edge the whole time, eyes constantly flicking to the man across the room. After dinner, we left the diner, and I thought maybe I'd finally put it all behind me. But as we made our way home, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the first red light, I glanced to my right, and there, parked next to us, was a white Honda. And there, sitting inside, was him. The man. He was staring directly at me, his eyes unblinking, unyielding. My heart stopped. I quickly told Jordan, and this time, he seemed concerned. His face grew serious, and I could tell he was starting to understand just how weird and wrong this all felt. As we neared my street, Jordan kept checking the rearview mirror. We made a couple of laps around the block to make sure we weren't being followed. I kept my eyes peeled, watching for any sign of the man. But after a few circuits, it seemed like he wasn't there. Jordan dropped me off at home, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, a sense of dread washed over me. My mom and sister were out at the mall, and my dad was away on a business trip. I was home alone, and the quiet of the house felt suffocating. I went inside, locking the door behind me, and threw myself onto the bed, hoping the day would fade into the background. But just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a faint noise. A tap at my window. I froze. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering in my chest. I slowly sat up and peered out of my window, trying to make sense of the shadows. What I saw next is something that will forever be etched in my mind, something that will never leave me. There, standing on my front lawn, was the man. He was just standing there, staring up at me, a wide, sickening smile stretched across his face. I couldn't breathe. Panic set in, and I scrambled for my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, whispering urgently into the receiver. "Please, someone's outside my house. He's watching me." The operator told me to stay inside and wait for the police to arrive. But when the police got there, he was gone, vanished into the night without a trace. I never saw him again after that night, but the terror I felt that evening never truly left me. The chill in my spine, the sense of being hunted, it stayed with me for weeks, maybe months. I quit my job at the amusement park as soon as it closed for the season. I couldn't go back there, knowing he might show up again. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't noticed him in the diner, if I hadn't caught him following me home. If I had ignored the feeling in the pit of my stomach, would I be telling this story now? Or would it have ended differently? Either way, it's an experience I'll never forget. One I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It was a rainy night, one of those downpours that soaks everything to the bone and blurs the world outside. I was working my usual late-night shift at the diner, a place I'd been employed at for over a year. It was almost midnight, and as usual, I was expecting a slow, uneventful night. Nights like this typically meant fewer customers. Who wants to drive in a torrential downpour, right? But even though I was prepared for a quiet evening, I couldn't have been more wrong. The rain was pounding against the windows when I saw them walk in, two figures dripping wet. The man looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s with a scruffy beard and wild hair. The woman with him, much younger, looked to be in her early 20s. They walked in together and their eyes locked onto me immediately. Something about their presence seemed off, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was just the strange feeling of the weather creeping into my bones or the fact that it was so late. I greeted them with a smile, though I couldn't shake off the unease that was starting to creep up my spine. "How many?" I asked, trying to stay professional. "Just two," the man said. His voice was deep, but his tone was strangely soft, almost too soft for the situation. I led them to a booth near the back, away from the small crowd of late-night regulars. As I handed them the menus, I noticed how quiet they were, barely speaking to each other. They seemed to be whispering, a soft murmur between them that didn't quite fit with the normal hum of the diner. I couldn't help but overhear a few words, though they were too far away to make out clearly. A few moments passed before the man turned his attention to me. "Do you live alone?" he asked, his voice low but direct. I paused, a bit taken aback by the sudden question. It wasn't exactly an odd inquiry, but something about it struck me as strange, considering how little we had talked up to that point. I shrugged it off, giving him a polite, disarming smile. "Yeah, I live about 10 minutes north of here," I replied. "It's quiet, pretty boring." He seemed to smile at that, as if he understood. The woman, however, didn't contribute much to the conversation. She barely spoke at all, only nodding or murmuring in response to things he said. I tried to push through the awkwardness by continuing to chat with the man, asking questions about his day, his trip, anything really, to keep the conversation going. But the woman remained almost completely silent. It was a quiet, uneventful dinner, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man seemed harmless enough, charming even, but there was something about his quiet, persistent demeanor that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't until later that I realized just how strange the whole interaction had been. About 45 minutes later, they finished their meal and left as quietly as they had come in. By that point, I was ready to close up shop. The rain hadn't let up, and my coworkers and I were all eager to get home. After a quick goodbye, I grabbed my things and hurried out to my car, not wanting to get drenched any more than necessary. I drove slowly, the road slick and dangerous, and tried not to think about the strange couple from earlier. But by the time I arrived home, I felt that familiar unease creeping back into my gut. I lived in a small building that housed 3 apartments, one on the top floor, one on the bottom, and mine in the middle. The building wasn't particularly large or well lit, but it was home. The parking lot was empty save for my car, and I didn't think anything of it. I had the place to myself tonight. My roommates weren't home, and I was alone in the building. I rushed inside, trying to avoid getting any more soaked by the rain. As I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and removed my wet clothes, I suddenly heard a frantic pounding at the front door. I froze. It was nearly 1 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? I hesitated, then made my way to the door. There was a glass storm door, and I always kept both doors locked for safety. I looked through the glass and saw a woman standing on the other side. She was drenched, her gray sweater soaked and clinging to her skin. Her hood was up, obscuring most of her face but her eyes. I could see her eyes clearly, and there was something unsettling about the way she looked at me, wide and desperate. "Please, can you let me in? I need to use a phone," she pleaded, her voice barely audible through the glass. My heart was pounding. Who was this? Why was she asking to use my phone at this time of night? I tried to stay calm and ask the obvious question. "Are you lost?" Her answer sent a chill down my spine. "There's a creepy man following me and I need help. Please, I need help." Something in her words felt off, but I didn't know what. I noticed she looked oddly familiar. Her face was hidden by the hood, but something about the way she carried herself seemed strangely familiar. I asked her, trying to hide my growing suspicion, "Who is he? Where is he now?" She turned around and looked down the dark street, her face filled with panic. "I don't know," she muttered. "Please, just let me in." She reached for the door handle, trying to turn it herself, but it was locked. That's when I realized why she looked so familiar. She looked like the woman who had been sitting with the man at the diner earlier that evening. My stomach twisted in knots. The pieces clicked together, and in that instant I knew something was very wrong. I leaned closer to the door and asked her point blank, "Weren't you at my diner earlier with that man?" She didn't respond. At first, I thought maybe she didn't hear me. But then she quickly turned away, her movements agitated. She looked back at me with wide, pleading eyes. But this time, there was something different in her expression. She wasn't looking at me as if she was scared anymore. It was more like confusion, maybe even annoyance. like she couldn't understand why I wasn't letting her in. And then, in a voice that sent ice through my veins, she screamed, "He's here!" I instinctively turned my gaze toward the street, and sure enough I saw him, the man from the diner, slowly walking toward the house. My heart stopped, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The woman turned back to face me, her eyes filled with panic. "Please, let me in," she begged again, but this time her voice was desperate, almost frantic. She reached for the door handle once more, but I didn't budge. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. As the man got closer, I realized with chilling certainty that I wasn't imagining this. This wasn't some coincidence. This was a setup. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I wasn't going to give them the chance to find out. "Go!" the woman screamed at him. The man began charging toward the door, and in that moment my heart pounded in my chest like a drum. I slammed the inner door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the locks. The pounding outside ceased, but I didn't dare open the door again to check. I had to think, and fast. I rushed to the stairway and knocked on the upstairs neighbor's door, hoping someone was home. I knocked repeatedly, but there was no answer. Desperation set in, and I tried the downstairs door as well. Nothing. I peered out the windows, but the parking lot was still empty. No cars, no sign of anyone. I was alone. Fear started to bubble in my stomach as the realization sank in. They had planned this. They had somehow tracked me, maybe even watched me at the diner. They knew where I lived. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and wait for them to break in. I went back upstairs to my apartment and locked the stairway door. The rain was deafening outside, but in that moment, the only sound I could hear was the rapid beat of my own heart. The knocking resumed. I froze, listening intently. It was coming from the stairway door, a steady, rhythmic knocking that felt like it was tearing through the silence of my apartment. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But there was no response. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. "Who is it?" I demanded again, louder this time. Still, no answer. Then, in a voice that sent a chill straight down my spine, the voice from the other side of the door whispered, "Your blood on me." I ran to my room and locked myself inside. My hands shook as I dialed 911, my voice shaking with fear as I explained the situation. I hid in my closet, waiting for the longest 10 minutes of my life. The rain, the wind, the occasional creak of the house, every sound was enough to make me jump. I stayed hidden in that closet, barely breathing, as I waited for help. Finally, the police arrived. I could hear their footsteps on the stairs, their voices muffled as they entered. They checked the front and backyard, and though they found no sign of anyone, they suggested I find somewhere else to stay for the night. I packed a bag quickly, left the building, and drove to my parents' house, my heart still racing in my chest. The next day, I returned to the house, hoping it was all just a bad memory. But when I opened the stairway door, I was greeted with a sight that made my blood run cold. On the door, written in dark marker, were the words, "Thanks for the service, Beth." I couldn't stay there anymore. Not after that. I moved in with my parents for a few weeks until I found a new apartment. And to this day, I don't know what those people were really after, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to find out. Better safe than sorry.